Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Post-G20 reflections, highlights from the South African presidency. I think many of us are in recovery mode from the last few weeks and the excitement of the G20 summit. Suffice to say, I think certainly the South African presidency of the G20 set out an ambitious agenda. Clearly an organization that is based on, or a grouping that is based on consensus, may not always be able to have the ambition of the initial agenda realized. But I think it has put, the South African presidency has put a number of very important critical issues for Africa and for the global South on the agenda, and which can then be taken forward in various other fora over the course of the next year. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Elizabeth Sidiropoulos. I'm the Chief Executive at the South African Institute of International Affairs, and SAIIA has been one of the co-chairs of the Think 20 process, and also a knowledge partner of the South African G20 presidency. It's really a great pleasure to have with us people who have been intimately involved with a number of the priorities that the South African presidency set for itself over the course of the year. I'm going to mention them right at the beginning so that we can then move from one presentation to another, so that we also then have an opportunity for Q&A. It's really great to have with us not just a member of SAIIA's International Advisory Board, a co-chair of the task force, the T20 task force on international financial architecture, but much more importantly, also a member of Trevor Manuel's panel, Africa expert panel, which produced a report in advance of the summit for consideration by the summit. Hannah Ryder, the CEO of Development Reimagined. Welcome, Hannah. It's great to have you again with us. Thank you for all your support during the course of this year. It's also really wonderful to be able to have the Sous Sherpa of the G20 and the G7 and APEC of the OECD, Litsa Vavakis, who has we've worked with on the G20 at 20 review, which is really one of the important outcomes of the G20 presidency, which we hope will also be taken forward in order to make the G20 much more effective in certain areas and obviously focused. We will also be joined shortly by Dr. Patrick Olomo from the African Union Commission. And he's got a long title. He's the acting director for economics, trade, development. It's the bigger commission that has the acronym of ETTIM, and I haven't written it down, so that's my bad. But he'll be joining us to discuss the G20 Africa Engagement Framework, which is one of the outcomes of the finance track this year. And then last but not least, of course, my colleague Alex Benkenstein, who heads up our climate program at SAIIA, who's also been very involved with the climate and environmental sustainability and climate working group, and also agriculture and food security during the South African presidency. Of course, this is 2 days into the American G20 presidency, but it's a good opportunity to reflect on where we've come from and where we might be going. We know obviously that the US presidency is going to be a very different one. But as I said earlier, there are opportunities for us to take forward some of the really key elements of South Africa's G20 agenda, some of it in the Africa expert panel, others in the inequality report that was chaired by Joe Stiglitz, others clearly well, the G20 at 20 review, of course, is very much about the G20 itself. But there are also other opportunities around infrastructure, around illicit financial flows, global public goods, that a coalition of the willing friends of these issues can drive forward. Let me stop there And let me hand over to Hannah Ryder, who will reflect a little bit on the Africa Expert Panel's report and the outcomes thereof. Over to you, Hannah.
Great. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and thank you to SAIIA for putting together this great opportunity to share what happened through the South African presidency, but also for all of your incredible work through the over the past year, especially T20, have really appreciated SAIIA's leadership during that time, and it was a pleasure to be a co-chair of the Finance for Development track during that period, and supported very much by SAIIA and the other think tanks who were working on that. So just a note on that. For those of you also who don't know me, I'm the CEO of Development Reimagined. We're an African-led, African-owned international development consultancy. But I'm here really in my role as one of the 26 members of the Africa Expert Panel, which was convened by the South African government and was chaired by Trevor Manuel, South Africa's former finance minister. It was an incredible honor to be part of this panel. The 26 members calculated that 77% of us were African. Well, we're still African now. But it's a brilliant set of people who come from all different perspectives, but are serious experts on development, not only through their academic record, but also through their experience. People like Donald Cabaruco or Carlos Lopez will be very familiar to everybody, but also Nobel laureates like Esther Duflo and so on. So we all got a chance to interact through this panel and really think around, bring our creativity and our knowledge to this question of what can the G20 do better for African countries. And really that was our main focus. We had, whenever you get into a discussion on African countries, it's very easy to start sort of looking inwards and sort of, we can do better and kind of do a little bit of beating up and so on, But that wasn't our point. Our point was really how, even though we must take account of what African governments and stakeholders are doing proactively to address some of the issues that we were going to talk about, and also where there are challenges and where things are not being done enough. But our main question was, what can the G20 do? So we really tried to focus our discussions in our eventual reports, which was presented to the South African government and then the G20 heads of state and government at the summit. We really tried to focus our report on that question. What can the G20 do? What levers does the G20 have that can be used positively to impact on development on the continent? And for any of you who've looked at the report, you'll see that also the title of the report was Growth, Debt and Development, Opportunities for a New African Partnership. So again, taking that, as I said, the key aspect of what can the G20 do? What does a partnership look like with the continent? What does a new partnership look like with the continent? But also, you can tell from the title that it also had a very optimistic tone. And I think that was very important. And again, it's something that we deliberated on, we're very intentional about as a panel. We wanted the G20 not to be looking at the continent. We wanted to make the case for the G20 not to look at the continent as this problem area. The AU is in the G20, South Africa is in the G20 because the continent matters. The continent is the world's 8th largest economy as a whole. That's why it's in the G20. there's massive opportunities for being the world's next manufacturing hub. That's why Africa's in the G20. So we really tried to have a very optimistic tone, and also trying to avoid some of the easy ways which might also not necessarily put Africa into the sort of structural transformation edge. So of course we talked a little bit about demographics. Of course we talked a little bit about natural resources, but that wasn't our main case. Our main case was, this is an opportunity, this is an economic opportunity, an economic growth opportunity. So again, we were quite intentional about some of these things, and I hope people do get that from the report. But I just wanted to reiterate it because we did have some very significant discussions about that as a panel altogether. When you read the report, you'll find that we had 4 areas of focus and a total of 13 recommendations. Again, we were very deliberate. We didn't want to have too many recommendations. 13 may even sound like a little bit too many, but nevertheless, it felt manageable. And we can also, obviously people are going to pick the ones that they think are most interesting. Media reports tended to focus on some of the debt recommendations that we had, but we didn't feel that any were more important or less important than others. We felt that all of them are really critical to take forward, and again, the G20 has the levers to take them forward. So I'll just go through some of those recommendations and the areas of focus for each of those. So the first area of focus was the debt challenges. And we put this first again because even though we are striking an optimistic tone, and even though we're looking at the future, we knew that this is what the G20 work most recently has been when it comes to the continent, especially coming out of COVID-19, where debt issues have really risen to prominence especially in terms of debt servicing. So in that area, we talked about the need for the G20 common framework to improve. We had some more specific suggestions for that, but really not with the idea of just this just being a G20 common framework, with the idea of thinking about it really into the long term as how does the common framework build towards a better, more functional multilateral sovereign debt resolution mechanism that's open to everybody if they need it, but also is much more predictable. So that was one of our key recommendations. Another was for a borrowers club. People ask, why would you have a borrowers club mentioned in a report that's going to the G20? The reason being is that the borrowers club will need to interact with creditors, and the G20 are the world's creditors. So the reason to mention it is to say the G20 needs to acknowledge it, to ideally even endorse it, and to say we will interact with this borrowers club. So that's why we put it in there. We also put in an idea for a G20 debt refinancing initiative. There are many that are being considered and drawn up right now. We didn't want to kind of decide on one today that we thought might go, but we thought it is important. It is a gap which is there, and so it needs to be filled. And so we wanted to give further impetus to that. And last but not least, in the debt area, of course, we talked about debt transparency and better analysis on debt. A lot of debt analysis is very often brings out a lot of biases and isn't necessarily really fully understanding the situations that African countries are in, and also the structural challenges that they face. And so being a bit more open and transparent about that, and again, also sharing things like contracts and so on, building the peer understanding of these things would be really crucial. So we endorsed that as well. I'm not going to go into the same sort of detail for all of the areas, but I just wanted to pick out a few which really which piques the interest, especially in media, and I think debt is definitely one. We had an area of focus also on productive investment for Africa. This, I think what's interesting to hear, to realize, and different from other reports that you might read here, is we had as much of a focus on accelerating productive investment through country engagement, national level engagement, things like country hubs and so on. But we also focused on engaging at a regional level, a sub-regional level. We thought that was a really important message to get across to the G20, that when you work with Africa, you have to also think about the regional engagement, not just national, especially because we have things like cross-border infrastructure requirements. You know, when we're looking at infrastructure, we can't just look at domestic infrastructure. We have to look at cross-border, because we are a continent that has so many borders, not of our own making, but we still have to deal with them. So this was one key point that we wanted to bring across. And also in that part, we also had some suggestions around how can we bring down the cost of capital for African countries, recognizing the very strong evidence on the Africa risk premium, and how we really do need to, how the G20 needs to deal with that, and especially through financial regulation. We had some brilliant experts on the panel who deal with and really fully understand some of these Basel III rules and other financial regulatory issues. And these ideas were, you know, we talked a lot about them, and again, brought some very clear recommendations around what can happen in those forums. They might seem that they're so far apart, but actually they have a huge implication for the continent. So we really tried to bring those through. And again, it's really in the purview of the G20 as a focus, you know, where it has the focus on finance. These sorts of issues really do are things that the G20 has the levers to take action on. Last but not least, we had two other areas: the mobilizing domestic resources, where we had to, of course, mention how the G20 does need to continue to push and take action. Well, maybe not push, be pushed by everybody else to take action on illicit financial flows, international tax cooperation. Probably we can't expect that much progress this year, but it's certainly something that can be picked up after this year on that. But we had to mention it because, you know, it is crucial in an area where the continent has been very, very active and proactive and really, really game-changing. So we had to recognize that. And as I said, the last area was on global, on finance for development. Here, you know, our main focus was how do you bring down, again, the cost of development finance? How do you expand development finance, even in a constrained ODA environment, an environment where donors are not yet, you know, finding it hard to make the case for development in their own domestic constituencies? What can be done? So we reached out, we still looked back and said, you know, the things around capital adequacy framework and so on of the MDBs, all of that definitely needs to go ahead. We do need to be pushing on the MDBs to be doing more. But we also made some very clear recommendations around the use of special drawing rights. This is money that is just sitting there and can be put to productive use. There's no reason why it shouldn't. And then similarly, we also talked about, we also looked at the IMF and how the IMF can be, we recommended that the IMF should be reviewed from an African perspective. So there should be an independent review of the IMF. We know that the US presidency will be interested in reviewing the IMF more in terms of going back to factory settings, I think the phrase was. We wouldn't mind it going back to factory settings, but factory settings with a in a post-colonial world where African members are just as important as the other members, and we have a seat at the table. So I think that was really what we were talking about, and reviewing how the IMF has really functioned for Africa and really looking how we can reform that. So I'll finish there. Just a sort of quick introduction on the panel's work. I should say also that we do expect to continue our work. The story doesn't end here. We realized that even a year is not enough to really get into some of these issues. And we wanted to have more time. We thought that the G20 also needs us, in a sense, to continue to work together and to pull together these issues. And there were areas where we felt there was more investigation needed by us that we just didn't have enough time to focus on. So we will continue working, and we will, and certainly I think in the early new year, we'll be regrouping in order to see what next, and also under the US presidency, find out what role we can play. So that's it from me. Thank you so much, and look forward to taking any questions later.
Great. Thanks very much, Hannah. That's a really good summary, a good overview. I tend to be really averse to having my cell phone return to factory settings. And I think your points about the IMF in that regard are probably, yeah, spot on. Anyway, thanks very much. What we will do now is move on to Litsa. Patrick has asked, he's running late, he's asked he will join a little later. So I think we'll just carry on down the list. So Litsa, over to you on the G20 at 20. And then just for the audience, just so that you know, we do hope to have enough time to have some Q&A. You can post, I think, Q&A ideally in the Q&A box or in the chat. I do have colleagues who will be monitoring that. So Litsa, over to you.
Oh, thanks very much, Elizabeth. And let me just start by saying thank you to you and the terrific team at SAIIA for the fantastic collaboration we had this year. But also, of course, SAIIA and the OECD have a long-standing relationship beyond our cooperation this year. But personally, for me, it was a real pleasure. And thank you for inviting us to talk on the G20 at 20 today. Reflecting on a presidency that steered the G20 through some pretty challenging geopolitical waters while putting the priorities and the perspectives of African countries front and center of the G20 agenda. From the Africa expert panel recommendations to the FMCBG statement on debt sustainability, the renewed compact with Africa 2.0. South Africa showed that the G20 is best placed to catalyse broad-based and inclusive growth when its agenda reflects the diversity of global challenges. And so it was very timely, given that Africa is the world's second fastest growing continent, but still facing entrenched challenges. It was really great to see the focus on Africa this year. The OECD was very proud to support the presidency's priorities in a number of work streams, tackling illicit financial flows, enhancing tax transparency, boosting youth and women's employment through the Nelson Mandela Bay target and the updated Brisbane Efequini goal on women, and ensuring that mineral resource wealth drives local growth and development, just to mention a few examples. In this spirit, I'm very proud to introduce the G20 at 20 review. So this assessment was requested by leaders in Rio de Janeiro in their declaration, in recognition that South Africa was concluding the first cycle of G20 presidencies since the elevation of the G20 to a leaders level forum in 2008. We supported this review as one of its lead knowledge partners, along with SAIIA and the University of Toronto's G20 research group. And the review was significant because it was the first systematic effort to take stock of what the G20 has achieved, how it's evolved, and how it can remain effective in the rapidly changing global context. And the exercise had three overarching objectives in mind: to assess the G20's impact, taking stock of its major commitments, initiatives, and targets since 2008, and identifying areas where further progress was needed; to reflect on the G20's internal working methods, looking at the effectiveness of its processes and exploring reforms that will make its work more efficient and its outcomes more action-oriented; And finally, to provide recommendations for the second cycle of G20 presidencies, informed by members' responses throughout the review. So to deliver on each of these objectives, the review was grounded in a number of different pillars. There was an electronic survey that the OECD developed and launched earlier this year. There was a dedicated discussion among G20 Sherpas in June that was facilitated by Elizabeth and SAIIA. There was written input throughout the process from G20 members and invited guest countries. And there was also an advisory panel of former G20 Sherpas, finance deputies, and other experts who had very deep knowledge of the G20 that was chaired by Ambassador Nozifo Makato Diseko. Leaders that were present in Johannesburg agreed that the G20 at 20 is going to be an ongoing process. So the findings that I'll briefly present now are intended to be very preliminary, but let me share a few of the highlights. First, the review underscored members' continued commitment to the G20 as the world's premier forum for international economic cooperation. In our survey of G20 members and guest countries, 9 in 10 respondents said that the G20 has strengthened multilateralism and enhanced international cooperation. There was broad agreement that in bringing together the leaders of the largest advanced and emerging economies in an informal setting, the G20 is very uniquely positioned to drive financial stability, tax cooperation, multilateral development bank reform, and debt restructuring for low-income countries. Again, just to name a very few number of examples. Second, it highlighted the G20's value as a crisis management mechanism and the importance of preserving it as such. When we look back at the G20's response to the 2008 financial crisis, which was its original raison d'etre, virtually all members think that this was the high watermark for the G20, along with its role in managing the pressures and uncertainties of the COVID-19 pandemic. One member during the process compared the G20 with a generator that needs to be kept running so that it's ready to act at the moment the next crisis hits. Third, the review showed that, excuse me, while 3/4 of members think the G20's effectiveness has decreased over time, they broadly agree on what needs to be done to improve it. So this includes refocusing the G20's thematic scope on its core mandate of promoting broad-based economic growth, reducing overlaps by streamlining the number of working groups, and enhancing continuity on key long-term priorities. There was also an overarching message around the importance of leveraging evidence-based inputs from international organisations and also through consultations with business and civil society through the engagement group process. Briefly to sum up, it's probably fair to say that the G20 will likely look quite different in the coming years. So we're hopeful that by reflecting the reviews of all G20 members as well as this year's guest countries, the G20 at 20 review will provide the building blocks for a renewed, fit-for-purpose G20. The inclusive process of the review, which, as I mentioned, brought together the OECD, SAIIA as one of this year's T20 leads, and the University of Toronto, has been a really terrific example of how international organisations, think tanks and research institutions can cooperate to support the implementation of G20 leaders' commitments. So we hope this approach provides a good model for the future. And let me say, we're really looking forward to our continued work with the G20, T20, South Africa, and of course, our friends at SAIIA. Thank you.
Right. Excellent, Litsa. Thanks very much for that, I think, really good good overview of some of the key issues. I think the report is really extremely valuable. My colleague has posted it in the chat if people want to access it. I mean, it goes, particularly the survey goes down deep into different dimensions of effectiveness, efficiency, and so on. And so I certainly urge people to look at it in greater detail. And it, of course, includes, the report includes both the survey, the Sherpa discussions, the panel input. So I think it's really, really Interesting. So I think somebody has asked to repost it. Okay, well, my colleagues will deal with that. I'm not the techie today. Not often, actually. So let me move on now to my colleague Alex. Dr. Olomo is going to join us a little later. So let's move on to reflections from your side, Alex, on just energy transition, the sustainable finance agenda, your broader involvement in those issues this year.
Perfect. Thanks for the opportunity. It's great to be part of this discussion. Well, as many I think in this group are aware, SAIIA, beyond its role in the T20, was working very directly with various ministries, groups of officials, technical teams within in the context of the different formal task forces and working groups of the G20. And my own engagement was primarily with the Environment and Climate Sustainability working group. I mean, obviously, if we're thinking about reflections on G20 outcomes, the first thing I think is a bit of a sense of surprise for those of us who were very close to the discussions happening in some of the working groups. Of course, not only that we had a leaders' declaration, but a leaders' declaration that expresses itself on some of the very difficult topics, and that includes climate change and the just energy transition. I mean, the just energy transition work itself, there was a core focus there within the energy transitions working group, of course. But let's remember that there was also work on scaling finance for just energy transitions in the sustainable finance working group, in the finance track. And then the environment and climate sustainability working group sought to advance some thinking around a whole of economy, whole of society transitions beyond purely the energy sector. There was some sensitivity about not stepping on toes in terms of the energy transitions working group, but I think an important discussion taking place. But sustainable finance, energy transitions working group all ended with chair summaries, not ministerial declarations. We had two ministerial declarations out of the environment and climate sustainability working group, but those dealt with crimes that affect the environment and air quality. So the just transitions work and the climate change work was not reflected in those ministerial statements. Those were also expressed in a chair summary. So again, I think fantastic that we managed to get that leaders declaration and that we managed to bring those topics into the leaders declaration. Just a side note on the energy transitions working group. In fact, if you look at the chair's summary that came out of that, there were only 5 G20 member countries that did not explicitly align themselves and support the outcomes of that working group. That is available on the chair's summary, and I'll post the link in a moment. So, we do tend to think in quite binary terms. Did we get a ministerial declaration or didn't we? But I do think it's worth reflecting on where we might not have quite had a consensus, but certainly a kind of majority support for certain views and ideas. So we were able to achieve that outcome. We actually had there's a section, I think paragraphs 23 through 30 deals with financing resilience and energy transitions. Of course, once we go into the content, I think there's some very interesting ideas there. I mean, at a broad level, we're not really seeing kind of breakthrough statements. I think those of us on the inside of the process realize that quite early that breakthroughs are not really on the table. And maybe one reflection is that holding the line is itself, in this multilateral moment, quite an achievement. It was interesting that the energy transition paragraphs didn't actually use the word climate change explicitly at all. It did come in a little bit later in the leaders' declaration. But in the energy transition section, the closest we get to that is reference to achieving clean and sustainable energy systems. But that fits in a paragraph that begins with an emphasis on advancing energy security, energy affordability, and access through diverse pathways and a technologically neutral approach. So these are all very telling phrases or concepts that have found itself into this discussion. We do find later in the declaration, and I believe this drew from that work in the Environment and Climate Sustainability Working Group, the emphasis around national just transition pathways as key enablers of climate action. So there, the just transition is very explicitly linked to climate action. The idea of a whole of economy and whole of society approach is brought in, and all of this is tied to sustainable development, equity, the eradication of poverty, and creating meaningful social and economic opportunities. Again, that idea of holding the line, I think, often these things are just assumed as standard, but I think it's important that some of the earlier frameworks and principle statements, the 2020 Saudi Arabian presidency's reference framework for effective country platforms, under the Brazilian presidency, the principles for just and inclusive energy transitions, India's lifestyles for sustainable development. I think it's noteworthy that these are explicitly mentioned. We've certainly saw in the negotiations how some country positions seem to be walking back or perhaps ignoring earlier commitments. And it was very important, as I said, to hold the line on the work that had been done up to the South African presidency on just transitions and climate. And the ideas themselves, so I guess there's the signaling value and then the content value, which can be two separate discussions. Most of what I've said up to this point is about the value of the signal, and again, I do think that has enormous meaning in this moment. But the content, when we look at concepts around tripling renewable energy production, increasing investments in the energy sector, technology transfer, the need to support energy access, of course, with a particular focus on Africa. These are important ideas. They are not new ideas, and there are no new, more ambitious targets, at least none that I've noticed. Perhaps in the discussion we could revisit this. As I said, I think quite telling that we see some of the ideas which are broadly in this space, in the debate around energy transitions, but I think particularly in the BRICS grouping, we've seen these concepts pushed forward. The idea that in paragraph 24, reaffirming that energy security remains fundamental to national sovereignty, economic development, stability, and global prosperity. The line that I mentioned earlier, talking about advancing energy security and affordability and energy access. And then this idea of technologically neutral approach, the idea that the subtext there is that, it's not necessarily around making fossil fuels the demon of the climate debate, but indeed the focus should be on reducing carbon emissions and increasing carbon sequestration, however you can do that, whether it's carbon capture, direct air technologies, the idea of clean coal. So there's a lot of subtext packed into this concept of technologically neutral approaches to just transition, and it's interesting that this is very explicitly mentioned in the declaration. There are some ideas, important work on clean cooking. South Africa put forward a voluntary energy security toolkit. These are all ideas that I think can be taken forward. Of course, it's very much a kind of coalitions of the willing or voluntary toolkits. I think it's important for the community of technical experts, think tankers, to dive a little bit deeper into some of these particular initiatives, see how they can be supported. Of course, some of that might happen through the G20, but we also need to look at other spaces, forums, processes, partnerships that can drive some of this work forward. I think it's noteworthy that the declaration speaks to the importance of country platforms. We saw a number of new country platforms emerge at COP30. And I think a lot of work to be done on ensuring that these country platforms are effective and inclusive tools, methodologies to advance a just transition. We see the idea of a just transition itself being explored in interesting ways. South Africa is working on a framework for adaptation transition. There's work around ecological transitions. We saw this framing of a whole of economy, whole of society transition. I think, it's an interesting tension that we have here in the sense of needing to unpack and ensure that this concept of just transition is broad enough to pull in the important issues and to create space for the diversity of national contexts that we have in Africa and around the world. But the tension is then, of course, that you may end up with a concept that begins to be defined so broadly that it means almost anything to anyone, and then loses some of its value in terms of taking us forward in a practical way. Of course, the work on critical minerals, again, not quite as, it's a voluntary framework. I think it is important. There was some very preliminary work that happened under the Indian G20 on critical minerals, but I think the signaling value of South Africa advancing the critical minerals debate within the G20, and some very specific references, it must be said, within the declaration around recognizing the importance of promoting minerals processing and the link to industrialization, the value chains within source countries. That this is not just about ensuring sustainable supply of critical minerals to those leading economies where green technologies are currently being developed. And then it must also be said that, the engagement groups, I think, are going to have to think very carefully around, or shall we say, the community that has formed around the engagement groups, because we don't know exactly what these engagement groups will look like next year, would have to think very carefully around how some of these ideas can be advanced. And that goes not only for Think 20, but for the business community, civil society, across the engagement groups, really. We had some of these earlier reflections around the time of the Think 20 summit, and I think at some point I said that, the G20 is not simply a process, it's a community. And I think that idea is really going to be tested next year. But I think there's a huge amount of technical work that can be taken forward, and there are some that are taking shape or beginning to take shape to advance some of this work. So a mixed picture, but I think really we shouldn't underestimate the signaling value of what we came out with in the Leaders' Declaration.
Great. Thanks, Alex. I think the point about signaling, but also the point about holding the line this year, I think was very important, because I think there is now a much more enabling environment to take positions that perhaps a couple of years ago countries may not have been too open about. And I think the climate working group and the related issues in the task forces, I think, reflected that, and we saw that also in the negotiations around the text in the Sherpa, in the final Sherpa meeting, and then the text. So thanks very much for that. It's great to welcome Dr. Patrick Olomo from the AU Commission. So let me hand over to you, Patrick, and thank you again for always supporting our attempts to bring G20 and African issues to a broader audience. Thanks, Patrick.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thanks for inviting me to share some perspective on the important topics that we are, analyzing today. And I would like to, at the onset, to recognize the presence of some of our friends. I can see Anna on the screen, and I can also see many of our friends who are, familiar with the work that we're doing. I want to say that we had quite an amazing year in the framework of the South African presidency, because we were able to bring to the table some of the critical discussion points that were important to highlight as, Africa and the Global South. And in that perspective, the Africa Engagement Framework, which is part of what I have to talk about today, was about. It is, a sustained engagement framework that needs to put at the center of the G20 finance track some of the critical issues that are important for Africa's development as we proceed forward. And in that perspective, I can say that the overwhelming support that we got when we presented the Africa Engagement Framework during the last finance ministers and central bank governor meeting in Washington was a testimony of that momentum in terms of providing support to Africa's priorities at the G20. And allow me to take us through some of those priorities to make sure that we are able to understand what we are aiming to do in the Africa Engagement Framework. In total, we can say that there are 5 key priorities. The first priority will be about fiscal and monetary challenges that needs to be addressed at the continental level. And for this, we are proposing a menu of policy focus area and options that needs to be considered when we discuss at the G20. One is about the fiscal policy, and here we look at the prudent fiscal policy that needs to be put in place to make sure that we are able to strengthen fiscal risk management at a continental level. The second point in that very important pillar that we are looking at is about monetary exchange rate and the financial policies that needs to be put in place. And then when you look at the context today, when we were discussing in the framework of the framework working group, if I may say so, one of the critical points was about the imbalances that we could see in terms of exchange rate and the management that was made by African countries and various other developing economies. So there is need for strengthened finance track or framework working group focus on this to make sure that we are able to address the challenges that are, that we can see arising from that. There is also need to encourage economic and structural reforms. And here we focus mainly on issues that are relating to boosting private sector engagement and participation in economic development, as this is critical to ensure that there is a much more wide acceptance of the private sector role as a development partner that contributes to unleashing the potential of the continent. The second pillar is about institutional areas that needs to be enhanced to improve governance. And when we speak about governance, we look at the issue of illicit financial flows that are depriving the continent of an approximate amount of $90 billion per year. But what we have as estimates based on the research that were conducted by the African Development Bank is that the continent is losing approximately $700 billion per year in corruption, in issues that are relating to poor, credit ratings, and also issues relating to the mispricing of our assets. The third pillar, and in this pillar, we are focusing on issues that are relating to enhancing domestic resource mobilization, because when we look at the global context today, you can see that there is a deep reduction of ODA, and that African countries as developing economies should concentrate on mobilizing domestic resources in a way that will allow them to be able to finance their development. And in this, we are supporting the development of a United Nations Framework Convention on International Tax Cooperation, which we believe will allow the balancing the taxing rights in developing economies. The third point will be about development and enhancement of domestic and regional infrastructure and facilitating the AFCFTA and Agenda 2063. When we talk about infrastructure here, we see the gap in terms of financing infrastructure that is estimated at approximately $100 billion per year. And for this, the South African presidency has put an emphasis on developing infrastructure as a key impediment that is, derailing Africa's development, process. And our aim is to ensure that we are able to develop infrastructure that will facilitate, regional development in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Area. The Continental Free Trade Area, and we have to remind ourselves about it, is a market of approximately 1.4 billion people today, with expectations to have the market being at the size of 2.7 billion people in just 2 decades as we speak today. So it is important for us to make sure that we are able to invest massively in infrastructure that are resilient, infrastructure that can accelerate Africa's transformation, and also harness the digital transformation that we see across the world, and where the artificial intelligence become the center pillar of that continental and global strategy. It is important as a fourth pillar to work together to enhance Africa's capacity in reducing the cost of capital, to make sure that the capital that African countries access is cheap, affordable, and that is also a capital that can support development. And in that perspective, there is a whole lot of work that will be done in terms of, managing the perception that the continent is facing today and the difficulties that we have. We've spoken about the issue of data, the issue of the credit rating methodologies, and various other issues that are, increasing the cost of capital at the continental level. Center pillar to this will be the work that we're doing on debt. And that is where I would like to maybe draw your attention on what we will do for next year. We will be, working with our member states to ensure that, we can have established what we call the African Debt Monitoring Mechanism, which is part of the recommendations that came from the debt conference that we had in Lome in May 2025, but also that is also part of the Common African Position on Debt. And on this, we will also be working to ensure that we have our Borrowers Club established. It is certainly one of the key milestones that we will see achieved there. We will be working also to support the operationalization of the African Financial Stability Mechanism that was already endorsed by our ministers of finance. And the process forward is what we want to drive in this critical moment to address debt vulnerability on the continent. We also are going to be working to ensure that we deliver on various other fronts, such as the common framework that we are pushing to be deeply reformed, to be timely, accurate, and comprehensive in terms of the support that it can provide to African countries. We would like to see it not only as the painful pill that some of our member states had to swallow, but as the opportunity for those countries to accelerate their progress with utilization of the debt that will be much more, sustainable. Now, the fifth pillar is on the role of the international financial institution in facilitating growth and development in Africa. And for this, we're going to focus on, ensuring that there is adequate provision of grant and constitutional resources. And for this, we do believe that the work that the, International Financial Architecture Working Group is doing at the G20 could be part of that conversation. It is also important to draw the attention on the MDB reforms that are, ongoing, to make sure that they address the challenges that, most of the developing countries and mainly African countries are facing when they want to access financing. Credit rating methodologies and modernization of their, policies and practices will also be at the center of that, global discussion. So that is the menu of the issues that we want to bring at the center stage when we talk about the Africa Engagement Framework. It is certainly extremely ambitious, but we have to understand that this is a plan that we would like to see as a 5-year plan from 2025 to 2030 to make sure that the G20 finance track keeps focusing on some of the priorities that are essential to unlock the potential of Africa as we drive structural transformation moving forward. So that is the package of or the menu of the actions that we are aiming to implement starting from now until 2030. And we do believe that the work that we started this year can speak loudly. We are aiming to implement the conclusions of what we had during the South African presidency. But the most important message that our ministers have underscored when we met in South Africa, and I remember that, Elizabeth, you came, you visited us during that exercise, was that we need to take also continental actions that are aiming to enhance, good governance, make sure that we fight effectively against illicit financial flows and all the other, type of issues that we're facing on the continent. Debt should remain at the center of the discussion. And I do believe that when you will see the 2025 G20 USA presidency, priorities for next year, you will see that there is a clear indication that they have taken note of the fact that there is need for a structured, support to African priorities. And those priorities are in the African Engagement Framework that we do believe can, trace the path for something sustainable in addressing the challenges that we're facing. So thank you very much once again, Elizabeth. Let me hand back the floor to you.
Great. Thanks very much, Patrick. And I think just a couple of points before we open up the floor. I think you highlighted the importance of data, and that also is something that we as an African continent and African countries really need to be able to provide the kind of data that actually contributes to addressing all of these issues. I want to come back to the common framework. Maybe I'll pose that question to both you and Hannah. And then, of course, just a reflection on the point in the engagement, in the African Engagement Framework about adequate grant and concessional resources. Of course, one of the things that South Africa has sought to emphasize this year is that we shouldn't just be looking at the quantity of finance, whether it is in climate or other development areas, but we've also got to look at the quality. That sometimes, often the quality is much more important in ensuring that we don't get into the spiral of debt than just focusing on the quantity. So that brings us to the end of our speakers list. So now I'd be very happy to open it up. I see there are a couple of questions here. The first one is for you, Hannah. You may have seen it, but I'm also happy for others to jump in if they would like to. It's what does the expert panel see as key avenues and moments for advancing some of its recommendations in 2026? So that is focused, that is addressed to you, Hannah, but I would like to ask the panel if they have any specific suggestions around what we do in 2026 anyway on many of the issues that we've discussed today. Patrick, you've already alluded to areas where there can be some good cooperation potentially with the US presidency, and perhaps you can reflect a little on that. Let's take that question, and then I'm going to move on to the next question by Kulakani, but let's take them one by one so that we don't lose track.
Okay, Elizabeth, shall I go first quickly?
Yes.
Yeah. So just in terms of key moments, I think we have one coming up very quickly. Of course, the ADF replenishment, African Development Fund. I mentioned that we did recommend strong replenishment for ADF. So of course that is one key moment. But beyond that, in 2026, I think the AU summit, Patrick has alluded to that in terms of building further consensus on these issues. We have a lot of consensus across the continent on what does need to be done on all of these issues, but it's sort of how do we implement that, and what kind of strategy do we take to make it happen? And I think the AEP will have thoughts on that. And of course, the spring meetings and the annual meetings of the IMF and World Bank, they'll be in Bangkok in 2026, which will be quite interesting. So how using that moment, I think, will be important, especially for things like the G20 Common Framework and building, and also the IMF review. Obviously, perhaps some discussions at the spring meetings about what the IMF review looks like, clarification about what an African perspective on that is. G20 summit itself and UNGA, I think, would be the main key points. UNGA, I think, is relevant in particular because of the discussions around borrowers clubs and borrowers forum. We had some progress on that already, and because of the Financing for Development conference. And so I think the AEP will also be following that too. So those would be our key moments, I think.
Patrick, I don't know if you wish to add anything on that more broadly beyond the AEP.
Beyond the ALP, in fact, there is need for us to bring to the fore the fact that there is need for a broader, consensus on the actions, the key actions that needs to be undertaken in support of Africa's development. And in that perspective, as Anna just rightly said, we have already had several commitments, we have had engagements and everything. What we need now is action. Action is desperately needed to ensure that, we bridge the gap between our policies and what needs to be done on the ground. And for this, time is absolutely right. This is why our ministers of finance and central bank governors have committed, in South Africa to ensure that we bring things in a much more brighter perspective at a continental level, because first and foremost, it is our responsibility to put things right. And we are working to do that, but we do understand that the international environment also needs to be conducive to ensure that the policies that we put in place are not, derailed by international issues that are not only connected to our reality. So that is what we're doing. And on debt, for instance, we even going beyond, because the actions that we are conducting are not only actions that are calling for the intervention of, the international partners. Those are key actions that are calling African, countries, African institutions to work together, first of all, to address, some of the challenges that we have on the ground. And then we can also, at the same time, work on the critical issues that we see in the international financial architecture that we have all said is not fit for purpose, it's not working, is not delivering. But now what we need is actions. Over to you, please.
Great, thanks. And I think that point about a sort of action also from our side, I think is critical as an African continent. That we have created, I think, some of the platforms upon which we can drive some of these forward, and I think we really now need to use this as an opportunity to accelerate them. Litsa, I don't know if you want to come in on any of this at this point. I see you've turned on your camera, or at least it has appeared on my screen. Are you okay at this point?
So perfectly okay. Just really interested in the responses from the other panelists. Thank you.
Okay, no, that's great, Litsa. Okay, so now we move on to a more geopolitical question from Kulekani Magubani from Sunday Times. He asked, to what extent, if any, should South African exporters be concerned that tariff tensions with the US could worsen following the bust-up between Pretoria and Washington over the weekend of the Leaders' Summit? That was the first question. The second question is, to what extent, if any, does the Troika mechanism of former, current, and future G20 presidents' states reduce the risk of the US isolating South Africa from next year's summit and ensure that South Africa's G20 program on African debt, just energy transition, and multilateral development bank reform remain intact? And then we have another question from Ambassador Jerry Magilla, but I'll come back to you on that, Jerry, just in after this. I don't know if anybody wants to take a stab at some of the questions around US South Africa. I know, Hannah, you're not a South African, but you may wish to comment on that. I'd be very happy to hear. I'm also happy to come in on those, but I don't know who wants to comment at this point.
Maybe I'll start, and then we'll see where it goes. On South African exporters being worried, I mean, look, it's very clear that for the US, tariffs are about far more than trade policy. We've seen that in the US-Brazil relationship play out this year. And this is certainly not the end of the story in terms of South Africa-US relations going through a tough time, perhaps the closing of just a chapter. So personally, I have no doubt that in some shape or form, there will be a response, and we are not going to see that as we have up to this point, only in the question of South Africa's participation in the US G20 presidency. There are going to be other elements of policy and diplomacy where we're going to see is repercussions too strong a word, but we're going to see this back and forth being taken forward in other forums. As for the Troika, I think it's less about the Troika and more about the G20 as a collective of member countries and regional organizations. It was very noteworthy that really, even up to the very, very last moment, President Ramaphosa insisted that the US has all the rights and privileges of a G20 member, that they are welcome if they wish to participate. The chairs and desks will be put out. That was a very clear message, an unequivocal message that came from the South African presidency. And this question of whether and to what degree South Africa participates in the US G20 presidency is not simply a question of US-South Africa bilateral relations. It is going to require, and we've seen some signals in that respect, it's going to require the G20 community to say that this is a community of member countries, and that there is a basic fundamental commitment to participation. It is quite simply not up to the presidency of a particular year to determine who does and who does not participate in the G20 processes that year.
Right. Thanks, Alex. I think very good there. And I think important to say that in terms of founding members, I mean, certainly every country has the right to invite guest countries or not. But I think the issue of member countries or members is another story. Hannah, I don't know if you want to come in here at all.
Yeah, I mean, I spoke to Semaphore about it even before the US said this, anticipating that this might be an issue. And it seems that the kind of initial threat that the US, and explaining that it is really exactly as Alex said, it really is a G20 members issue in general. It's not just about the Troika. And my point was absolutely that the other G20 members should be ready to boycott the US exclusion, USC excluded any meetings that do exclude South Africa, because this is, anybody who studied international law, we know that international law is not created just by writing things or by, it's not like domestic law. International law is created by the actions of countries. It's created by precedent. And so enabling this kind of precedent for one G20 country to exclude another is undoing a great deal of work and a great deal of consensus around how the G20 works. So it's extremely challenging and opens the door to a whole set of other challenges. And so I think in the sense of protecting multilateralism, we know G20 isn't, it doesn't include everybody, of course, by design, it's plurilateral, but protecting these kinds of mechanisms where countries can work together on key issues, and especially when there's a time of crisis. It might seem easy at this point when there is no serious crisis, attacking everybody. We haven't got a COVID-19 again right now. And so it might seem, it doesn't really matter. But we just don't know what the consequences are and what kinds of doors can be opened as a result of it. So I think the G20 in general need to be very, very careful at this point and give all of the signals to the US that this is totally unacceptable.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks, Hannah. I don't think I need to add anything to what the two of you have added. There was a question from Ambassador Magila about, and I see that unfortunately Patrick has dropped off, but will the AU incorporate South African issues in the event President Trump denies visas to our participants at G20 meetings in 2026? And of course, just on that point, you may not be invited, you may not be uninvited. Well, you can't really, it's not about uninviting, but nevertheless, but you may be denied visas, and we know that has been wielded this year as well. I mean, while I don't speak for the AU, but let me just make one observation that clearly a lot of the items on the South African agenda were aligned with the African Union priorities, whether we're talking about debt and finance or climate transitions and so on. So my sense would be that I think we are on the same page on these issues. And certainly the Africa Engagement Framework is a platform, the debt sustainability document, that the outcome document, which was adopted by consensus, unlike the fourth that was the one outcomes document that came out of the fourth finance ministers and central bank governors. So there is a platform with which the AU sort of has worked together with South Africa and I think would drive that forward. But yeah, as you have all said, it's not about excluding South Africa.
Well, exactly. The AU, if South Africa is an empty seat, the AU will probably need to have an empty seat too.
I think the issue here is that the importance of precedent, because if that then works this year and next year, if I simply don't like you and so I won't come, or if I don't like you and I'm chairing so I won't invite you or allow you to participate, that really sets a precedent that makes the G20 and the whole principle of consensus, which Litsa, I'm not sure if you mentioned it, but the importance in the G20 at 20 review of consensus, that consensus needed to remain the basis for this grouping, that in fact you couldn't adopt a principle of sufficient consensus, which means that most countries agree, but others don't, and you have an outcome. There was real unanimity on the importance of consensus. And so this ironically then sort of undermines that. Just on that, I mean, I think the US did participate in the panel discussions on the G20 at 20. They were there. So just to flag that. I don't know if there's anything you want to add, Hannah, before. Sorry, Hannah or Litsa? Okay, I'm going to assume we move on to the next question. And the next question was from Benji said, Olomo, do you believe that BRICS members have the appetite to boycott G20 2026 if South Africa is not allowed to attend? Okay, so pretty much in the same vein. Let me go to Hannah. Hannah, given your work in China particularly and in East Asia, let me hand over to you first.
Yeah, I don't know how much this is being considered live at the moment, but I think all the signals are significant support for South Africa, right? So I don't know whether they do have the appetite. I think they should have the appetite in the spirit of not against the US, but in terms of the spirit of protecting the institution. And that is a very different basis for not joining those meetings if South Africa cannot join them. And that's why I said even the AU, it's something that the AU has to be considering as well. If South Africans cannot join that meeting, should the AU also do so? And I think every G20 member needs to be ready to boycott. Yeah.
Right, thanks. I don't think there are any other questions. I don't know if there is anything anyone wants to pose now. Otherwise, I will perhaps just pose two questions specifically to Hannah now that Patrick has gone. And one really relates to perhaps unpacking a little bit what are the kinds of changes one would like to see in the common framework. I mean, part of the conversation has been around middle-income countries being part of that. So perhaps just elaborate a little on that. And what was interesting, I was sitting in the room when Minister Manuel was presenting the high-level summary at the Sherpa meeting. Of course, the issue of the IMF review, an African review of the IMF, and people were saying, well, surely it should just be a review of the IMF. It's not specifically an African. Why should it be, would we be able to get that idea through? So perhaps just reflect a little bit on what the panel's thinking was around those issues.
Okay, so I'll talk about common framework first. It's very clear that middle-income countries do need to have the option to join. Whether they will join is another question, whether they would use that mechanism, because at the moment, we do know that when countries do seek support under the common framework, they are punished by markets. And this is one of the issues that middle-income countries will obviously face. There are also other aspects of it, though. Things like enabling efficiency by having countries being able to go to different creditors at the same time, as opposed to having to do it in a sequential way, which has no logical basis, in fact, but has just become a way of doing things. So I think one of the things that, as the panel and as experts in general, what we try to do is sort of think, well, are these rules there because they're rules of practice, or are they, and again, how international law is formed, or are they there because there is some real reason for them? And where there isn't a real reason for them, then let's see if we can find some kind of efficiency. So those are the sorts of changes that we've suggested, as well as, of course, at least having some kind of ambitions on timeline. You can't enforce it. There's no way of enforcing any of that, but at least say, we really do need to get these things done. And I think allowing, if you look at Zambia's case, for instance, when Zambia was actually able to go over to China, that was one of the key things that unlocked that whole negotiations for Zambia. So that's one aspect, and there's lots of different specific recommendations for the framework. But the middle-income countries opening is one, and then the other is around efficiency. The idea, one thing I have talked about but not necessarily incorporated into the report, is really about how all the creditors think about the G20 framework. Is it really about, you know, just restructuring in order to get that restructuring done to provide some short-term liquidity, etc., and then the IMF can come in and sort everything out? Or is it actually, how do we provide countries with a fresh start? And I think that's something which brings the G20 mechanism closer to what is being talked about in the UN, where in the UN there's a discussion around an actual, you know, bankruptcy court, effectively. So how do you move the G20 common framework in that direction? Not everybody on the panel, you know, and again, we're a panel, we've all got different thinking. I have this thought, you know, my firm has these thoughts around fresh starts. Not everybody does. It wasn't in the report, but these are some of the things that at least, you know, we get to discuss and we can put to the fore. With your second question was on, I lost it, didn't I? IMF. Why did we suggest just an African review, or a perspective from an African? It is possible to look at the IMF in all sorts of ways, and we do know that the US presidency is very keen to effectively review the IMF and perhaps make it somehow a bit more targeted, etc., almost like making the G20 more targeted. Scott Bessent talked about putting it back to factory settings, as I mentioned earlier. The reason for talking about the review from an African perspective is that there are some very specific issues that the African continent does have with the IMF. We are also the only region that does not have, at this point, our own monetary fund. We are working towards one. We have agreement that there should be one. We have the protocols in place, but we still haven't got there. So we do rely specifically on the IMF, whereas lots of the other regions have other fallback mechanisms that they can use. IMF really is our current last resort. But we have so many constraints, including because of our shares in the IMF and so on. So there are some specific things. That's why we said we want to do it from an African perspective, that it should be constrained in that way. And you know, to be honest, I think this one is where there is almost an easy win for the US, because every presidency, a lot of presidencies will want to do something that's African focused, right? Here is one where you do have a concentric circle that sort of overlaps a little bit. And whereas other ones don't overlap so well, even though the US is coming at it from a different perspective, they want something different, but there is a possible overlap there. And maybe it might move forward. We'll see.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Hannah. That's really useful. I'm glad to see that Patrick is back. I don't know if I should ask you this question, but there was a question that was posed that said that if South Africans were denied visas to participate in the G20 next year, what would the AU do? Would it advance some of the agenda? Should it simply also not participate? Am I putting you on the spot here a little, Patrick, with a very highly political statement? But perhaps you can reflect a little bit on where you see the areas where we can work together.
Thank you very much. And what I will say here is just an opinion of someone who, you know, can express himself on its own position. What we know is that in international settings, there are some, discussions that are certainly happening to ensure that the G20 remains an inclusive platform where all the members participate fully in all, the meetings and negotiations and all. So we do believe that, the situation will be resolved and that things will move in the right direction as we proceed forward. On the African Union agenda, and I have said it clearly when I made my first intervention, is that we are, in full support of the excellent work that was done during the Global South presidency of the G20. And you do believe that there is a structured way that we have understood, the positioning of the Global South member of the G20 that have had the opportunity to, had presidencies before South Africa. The South African presidency, as I said earlier, provided an opportunity for us to maybe refocus the attention on Africa's, African priorities. And those priorities are outlined in the, the Africa Engagement Framework, which is one of the outcome documents that we, had an overwhelming, endorsement and support when it was presented in Washington during the last FMCBG meeting. And I do believe in my personal position and capacity that, that, overwhelming support that we have seen when we all endorse the Africa Engagement Framework, shows that there is a global interest in support of African priorities beyond the G20 South African presidency. It wasn't an African Engagement Framework that was supposed to stop in 2025, but it is a comprehensive plan that shows that there is, continuity in the way the G20 finance track will be supporting African priorities moving forward. And if you have had the opportunity to look at the G20 Leaders Declaration, there is mention to the Africa Engagement Framework and the support that will be provided. And if we believe that we had an overwhelming, endorsement of the G20 Leaders Summit declaration, it means that there is a continuity that we will see in the next presidencies, even beyond the US presidency that has started already and that we are very eager to be participating in, because we do believe that there is always room for negotiations. There is always room for diplomatic, negotiations that could lead to meaningful achievement and to meaningful adoption of key strategic documents that will pave the way for structured engagement or for structural development. So for us, that is how we see things. And we absolutely do believe that the G20 American presidency, will lay the ground for something substantial in terms of supporting the continental priorities. We had some engagements with them earlier already, and we are reassured by the fact that they also echoed the need to sustain the momentum in support of Africa's development, because as we said also, as I said, in my last submission, Africa is certainly the continent that has the potential to also boost not only Africa's growth, but global growth, because you have the demographics that are showing that there is something important happening on the continent. You have the resources, you have the market that we are building in the framework of the African Continental Free Trade Area. It is an investment opportunity, not only for for Africa, but is an investment opportunity for all the G20 members that have understood that time has come to support Africa and to move that agenda forward. So that is what I can say to make sure that we are not getting into undiplomatic language or to say something that may take us back in the negotiations that we are conducting. But we are absolutely convinced that we will find a way of moving forward together with a G20 that remains united, to address the challenges that we're facing. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Patrick. A colleague has just flagged a tweet or an X from SABC journalist Sophie Mokoena, This is breaking news that came in a couple of hours ago. United States of America will host the first G20 Sherpas meeting in Washington on the 15th and 16th of December. In the invitation, the US has made it clear South Africa is not invited, in line with recent pronouncement by President Donald Trump. That's the tweet. Nevertheless, I do hope that over the course of the next few days, that issue can be addressed and resolved. Clearly, for all the points that both you, Patrick, as well as Hannah and Alex have highlighted in the discussions this afternoon. So all that remains then, ladies and gentlemen, is for us to bring the meeting to a close. It's really to thank wholeheartedly Hannah, Ryder, CEO of Development Reimagined, Litsa Vavakis, the Sous Sherpa of the G20 from the OECD, Dr. Patrick Olomo, the Acting Director of Economic Development at the AU Commission, and of course my colleague Alex Benkenstein, the head of our climate program at SAIIA. Thank you all for making inputs, the questions that you have posed, and I think we continue onwards and upwards. Thank you all very much.
Thank you. Excellent.